So the kind of subtitle to this workshop was military spending and what it could be used for. And obviously books, not bombs. The more research I did, I realized how easy it is to illustrate the difference and the discrepancy between military spending and education spending. But one of the primary source of funding for post-secondary education in the provinces is federal transfers of money that are transferred from the federal government to the provincial government to be spent on colleges and universities. And currently, for this year, for the fiscal year of 2009-2010, that amount was $3,332 million, so approximately $3 billion was transferred to the provinces and territories. Today, government funding, so this transfer, as well as the provincial money that's put forward by the different provincial governments, accounts for approximately 57% of university and college funding. About 20 years ago, it was as high as 82%. So we've seen over the past 2 decades, we've seen a huge drop in the amount of government funding. And what happens when the government stops funding or withdraws funding or decreases funding is that the universities and colleges have to make up that money another way. And one way that was mentioned today in the panel this morning was getting corporate sponsors to sponsor research or help you build infrastructure, and you name a room after them, things like this. But the number one way that colleges and universities make up this difference is by increasing tuition. And you can see that if you look at the tuition rates over the past few decades, they've skyrocketed. Interestingly, at the end of World War II, the federal government started offering grants to returning soldiers as part of efforts to reintegrate veterans into Canadian society. And they started directly funding universities and colleges, and provincial governments stepped in line with this at about the same time. That was after World War II. By the mid-60s, tuition costs were minimal. And in fact, by the late 60s, Newfoundland and Labrador had eliminated tuition costs altogether. So you could go to college or university in Newfoundland or Labrador, you didn't have to pay tuition. There may be fees, student association fees, these things, but no tuition. In the 1970s, the debate around tuition wasn't so much about tuition freezes or tuition decreases. The debate was around eliminating tuition. That's what people were talking about, that education should be free, access to education should be free, and the way to do this was to remove that barrier of tuition. And then the 80s came, and there was a recession, and the government started clawing back funding, especially the federal government, to colleges and universities. And as a result, colleges and universities, in order to make up this money, increased tuition. In BC, it's about $5,000. So then what does this mean? The result of this high tuition is, in the end, the result is an unequal access to education. Because high tuition obviously makes it unaffordable for working people to get into college or university. So students like myself who want to go to school, we wind up borrowing money from the government. In the late 90s, it's probably shouldn't be a surprise, but in the late 90s there was this huge increase in the amount of money that students were borrowing to go to school. And this coincides with these increases in tuition and these decreases in funding to college and universities. The current total owing in federal student loans is over $13 billion. And this is only federal student loans, because provinces will also loan you money to go, and this doesn't include private loans. So a loan like a line of credit from your bank or your credit card. That's strictly the money owed to the federal government in student loans. And it's going up all the time, constantly increasing, because we're constantly borrowing and then interest accrues on these loans. So to try and bring this idea of military spending into it, one option for young people is to join the Army, because we've seen increased military spending and increased commitments to military operations, which means that as a result, the Department of National Defense is hiring. They're hiring soldiers, they're hiring bureaucrats, they're expanding. The annual salary of a new recruit in basic training is approximately $31,000. And this, remember, this includes room and board. If you're at basic training, you have a house, you're even supplied with clothes, you have food, you don't pay rent at basic training. This increases with the amount of training you get. It increases if you get promotions and you climb the ranks. Furthermore, if you're in the Army, you can pick up a trade for free because the Army will train you to become an electrician or a welder. A minimum wage worker in BC earns approximately $15,000 a year. That's assuming that you're working full-time, and service industry minimum wage work is notoriously part-time, notoriously less than full-time work. So this is kind of the end result of these decisions about funding. If we fund military in the Department of National Defense, or if we fund education and we fund university and college, what kind of choices are we putting out there for young people? More interestingly, the Department of National Defense, in their budget, they have planned spending for 2009 of more than $19 billion. $19 billion, and they transferred $3 billion to the provinces for post-secondary education. So it's a huge discrepancy. And then, of course, there's the cost to human life. There's been 1,443 soldiers killed in Afghanistan alone since 2001, since we intervened. But the number of civilians killed in Afghanistan is anywhere between 9,000 and 12,000, a very conservative estimate. So there's, it's not just money that increased military spending wastes, it's human lives or limbs. We're seeing a large number of wounded soldiers come back. So is it fair to say that Canada and America are in Afghanistan for humanitarian reasons when we're not intervening in other parts of the world for these same reasons? I don't think so. Afghanistan, unlike Rwanda, is really strategically located for where it is in relation to the Caspian Sea. So it's one country away through Turkmenistan, which is on the Caspian Sea. Afghanistan borders Turkmenistan. The Caspian Sea is rich with oil and gas, and two other large powerhouse nations, Russia and Iran, have already accessed the oil and gas in this area. And the United States and Canada have been trying for many years to access these resources. Prior to our intervention in Afghanistan, even prior to 9/11, there was very friendly talks with the Taliban about establishing American and Canadian interests in this region. One of the often quoted, or the more familiar such links, is Dick Cheney, the former Vice President of the United States, was the CEO of Halliburton, which is one of the major oil company players in this region. And he helped to construct a lot of the policies of Halliburton in Afghanistan and Iraq. But also Canadian business, we can't simply blame this on the Americans. It's not one country. John Chrétien, our former Prime Minister, has represented Canadian oil companies who want to invest in this region and who want to invest in along with the Americans and American companies, building an oil pipeline that would span the Caspian Sea, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan in order to access these resources. So we have very direct interests in this area. I don't think the war in Afghanistan is about democracy, and we can look at the recent accusations of democratic fraud in Afghanistan under the government that's supposedly been helped to rebuild by Western nations, or about women's equality. The same Afghani parliament recently passed laws that restrict women's mobility and their rights within marriage. So this war is at its base, it's about accumulating capital. It's about accumulating more capital for interests that are not mine and yours. Inevitably, under capitalism, war will always be a symptom of the system. If it wasn't Afghanistan, it would be somewhere else. Inevitably, the drive and the motive is to increase profits. Post-secondary education is not a huge profit maker, but oil in the Caspian Sea definitely is. and that's where the priority lies. So I was kind of hoping that other people would have opinions or would want to intervene on what they thought the solution would be to something like this.